We're here with another episode of what I'm calling Mapping Gnosticism, and I'm here again with Deacon Jon and Nick Chetty.
Hey, everybody.
Pulling this up from a recent episode we just did about what is Gnosticism in 2026. We did a quick survey. We sort of said that there's three general camps, traditionalists who are focusing on classical Gnostic texts, mystics who are people who are like kind of using it as a grab bag of whatever kind of mysticism that they find also gels a bit with Gnosticism. And then I think we were suggesting there's like the hardcore rebel version of Gnosticism, which is seeing Gnosticism specifically in a frame of rejecting mainstream, rejecting monotheism, rejecting all like a process of rebellion and rejection. Inside that, there's a bunch of other approaches to that. So if you want to kind of go over what those approaches were in the last episode, definitely come back to that. But the reason I'm mentioning it here is because it's also a part of the discourse of Gnosticism, how we talk about it. And that's what we're talking about here today, is the Gnostic media landscape, at least at the moment in 2026. Because how you talk about something is also the map of how you encounter that thing. Because our language is how we draw the map around our experience, which is otherwise impossible to describe. So yeah, I think like when it comes to my understanding of the Gnostic media landscape, of the discourse, is that we've got social media, so people posting, asking questions, writing responses back and forth. We've got like essentially web forums, but focused on questions in places like Reddit. We've got chat in like things like Discord and things like that, where it's more of a rolling conversation. And then we've got like the old standard blogs and newsletters and things like that are a little more long form, and it's all this process of conversation. But I think it's hard not to focus specifically on social media because it feels like that's where we encounter it the most. Is a bold question here right off the top: is the short form world of social media like TikTok, Instagram stories, Facebook Reels lending itself to reductionist Gnostic takes? Is 10-hour AI slop videos that are jammed full of like repetitious, boiled down Gnosticism with most of, if not all of, the nuance gone? Are these lending itself to reductionist Gnostic takes? What do you think, guys?
Yeah, I think by the very nature of the medium, the question has to be yes, right? But by the very nature of the medium, we can say that about just about anything that has depth, right? Any kind of religion, any kind of philosophy, any kind of art, any kind of political thought. So the answer is always going to be yes, right? Because this is very complicated stuff. We got thousands of years, so on and so forth. Now, there's good ways to be reductive and bad ways to be reductive, right? I would say with these short form medias, if you're pointing towards something bigger, right? If it's the beginning of an exploration, then I think that can be helpful, healthy. But in general, a lot of the short form stuff, it's just not great, right? It's just not going to be great. It's the very nature of what it is. But all that said, it's intensely popular. If you're interested in Gnosticism and you're spreading the word, you want to explore it, you're doing a media project like we are, then you want to be on those platforms, right? To be reaching people, to be talking with people, to be engaging with people. But I think, Jason, you have to be very aware of the limitations, right? Of what the medium is, how it works, the ruling of the algorithm, the demiurgic algorithm, what the algorithm likes or the algorithm doesn't like, even if you're not trying to ride the algorithm, right? You don't want to become a slave to it in a certain degree. So that's a lot of my thoughts about that. At the end of the day, yeah, it's reductive, it's bad, and you can only get some partial ideas across. That said, should people not be doing it, not using it? I don't think so, because it's unfortunately the way that our world is working right now, and it is our media landscape. That said, there's fun ideas around Gnosticism. There's some short short, sharp stuff that you can get out there. Display one saying from the Gospel of Thomas with some amazing art and some amazing music. Okay, there we go. There's something for somebody to chew on. Even sometimes pointing out like a single Gnostic idea in a film or TV show to blow people's minds, right? A Gnostic piece of music from a great composer. Okay, here, the composer was inspired by this. Here's this piece of music on the set on a TikTok. To know more, look into these resources. So, I think there is definitely some fun, interesting, and more healthy ways to use these mediums. So again, as per usual, a bit of a mixed message from me, but if I needed to boil it down, if I needed to give a straight answer, yeah, it's bad. It sucks. Should people like us not be doing it? Probably not, right? You got to find a way. All that said, Talk Gnosis, the Gnostic Wisdom Network, we don't do short form content. I'm a bit of a hypocrite here. I've been meaning to get on the TikToks and the Reels and the YouTube Shorts and the Instagrams and what have you. Any kind of social media besides posting the show. I would say as well, Jason, specifically for social media, that is text based. Your Twitters, your Facebooks, whatever. Again, lots of dangers. I think we're well aware of them. We know that the algorithm likes lifting up contention, arguments, bad stuff, right? That said, these written mediums do have potential and do have some great conversations, right? Now we can get engaging. Now you can talk. Now people can share ideas. People can have an insight that blows your mind, maybe even as a poster, right? Oh, I never thought of it that way. Of course, with that, I think, as just about everybody knows, that has to be tightly watched. As you need to have the mod and have the mod hat on, I would say, because some unsavory stuff can get in there pretty quick by unsavory people. So there's kind of my take in general.
Yeah, that
the short form media, you never really get past the opening, kind of. It's always always a beginner. It's always, what is this? I mean, we've I think the work that we're doing in episodes like this is to try to move past that, but it's because of the way the algorithm works, it's always easier to do it as kind of a brief introduction or a brief review or something like that, and doesn't really lend itself to deeper kind of content. I think even with the text-based stuff, I used to, and this is how I met John, is on these forums, kind of old. Now it seems really old school to be like Facebook forums or Facebook pages and Facebook groups, but even those, they allow for pretty long-term relationship and some deeper conversations. But I think even that had a limitation where people kind of always stay at the beginning of whatever they're doing. And, it doesn't, it's like we're always about to start something, but then it doesn't necessarily move. So, since Talk Gnosis didn't do short form content, maybe I think people in the world are getting skeptical about it anyway. So maybe people will turn on it before, you could say that's why you didn't do it for moral reasons.
I'll release a single TikTok saying we're not on this platform for moral reasons.
Yeah, TikTok's got, because of all the issues with surveillance and stuff on TikTok.
Bringing up TikTok is interesting, especially because if it's stuff in the news lately around, it's been the censorship of it is that. And when we talk about social media, there's also, I think, the implicit element here that we don't control those platforms. Like again, like Nick, you were talking about the old days of Facebook discussion pages. I'm thinking of the even older days of literal web forums that people would generally like host on their own web servers in their houses, like these old school, or BBSs, if you want to go really far back, where at least your connection to whatever platform you were speaking on was pretty close. Whereas here, a lot of the platforms we're on could disappear without our control. We have no way of. I actually think a lot about Discord. I don't know who owns Discord. I don't know who runs that whole organization. And if at some point they decided to triple their bill, or whatever, how many thriving conversational areas would just disappear, So there's something there too about how free can you be to communicate and express when you're on a platform that can change on a whim. And on things like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, where if you've built not just your interests, but a business, like people who actually are making a living from this stuff, are built on a platform that they don't control, that can and has changed on them. and has changed them how they create their discourse. They then create content that suits the platform, not the subject.
Yeah. I had a job. Perhaps will remember the fad for Facebook quizzes, which what Harry Potter house are you in or whatever. So I had a job writing those that was really fun, and the Facebook algorithm was really liking them. And I guess come with solutions, not problems, is what you're supposed to do in the workplace. But almost from day one, I kept saying, look, right now the algorithm loves us, but Facebook will flip a switch and the entire business will go down the drain. Like, we have to start thinking about this now, right? And they were like, no, you don't understand. We make money for Facebook. We do engagements. We have a close relationship. We have a rep that we work with, yada yada. And of course, a year later they flipped the switch and the business went down the drain. Even if it was helping Facebook, Meta is a huge company, and this was only a fly, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I lost that job. So that's just it, right? You built a whole business on something that you don't own, don't control, that is in the hands of somebody else, and that somebody else does not give a care about you in the whole world, right? And this is somebody who's making big money for Facebook, so let alone think of the quote unquote customers.
Yeah, another thing. Oh, sorry. Good.
No, go ahead, John. Or Nick.
I was just going to say that I think that even though Gnostics maybe on the internet or occultists want to think that they have all these dangerous ideas and are going to get silenced or something, the other thing that maybe we could talk a little bit about, but even though I don't think it's as big an issue maybe with this community, is just the ways that censorship works on these platforms. I mean, not just the algorithm in terms of what it's going to kind of rise up to the top, but I know a lot of people in the burlesque community in New York. And so that, like, I do photography with them sometimes and like things like that. And, obviously there's all of these rules relating to like artistic expression, the female body. If you're like, you get banned, even if it's not, pornography, it's like art or something, you'll get banned from these platforms constantly. So, this was your income or the way you promoted yourself. And then you get out, trans communities are dealing with that a lot, various like activist marginalized communities the thing with TikTok recently about politics and banning certain keywords and other things like that. So, that's always going to be once you're in that kind of realm, you're under the control of whatever whim is happening politically or ethically.
Yeah. Well, and there's a whole kind of demiurgic question there too, of like operating in a realm you don't control with forces that are not necessarily caring specifically about you. I like to tease some of my fellow Gnostics who are Apple users that like Apple feels like a pretty demiurgic company. Like, they tightly control their stuff. Like, you literally, to do certain things on your devices, you have to jailbreak them. You have to like, it's like I don't believe in the prison planet theory, but the prison planet of Apple does appear to be a thing that you escape from.
Well, it's also even words. I don't know. Are we allowed to say death or suicide on this channel? How in Instagram they invented an entire, you have to say unalive someone and things like this now.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you can speak using like anatomical words or words for things like death, then what is that theologically? That's kind of interesting. Like, you have to be unalive, you can't be killed. So
and Gnosis itself, the part of this is it used to just be a YouTube show, and then due to requests, and I think due to common sense, we started putting it out as a podcast, right? And that did lower the YouTube hits quite a bit, but it balanced out. But all of our videos easily within like the first week we get a couple thousand views, and for a big YouTube channel, of course that's nothing, but for us and for this niche, that's pretty great. Now after a week being on there, 400 views and maybe a couple thousand downloads. So the podcast did cannibalize the YouTube views, but I don't think that was the only thing. At some point, the algorithm changed for YouTube and it left us behind, right? So that there's a small example of what we're talking about. And it could have been, particularly during lockdown and particularly as conspiracy culture started to really get into mainstream media, the discussions, the understanding of conspiracy culture. I did a run of shows, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about this soon, conspiracy culture and Gnosticism, because they are associated in the public's mind. And I think that's something that is not helpful, could be toxic, could be bad, but have you. So obviously it's something that I wanted to dive into because it was the thing. And I wonder, as YouTube came under fire for promoting conspiracy content, that if our sort of basically anti-conspiracy content got swept up in that. I have no idea.
Yeah.
So, but it was around that time that, you know, I started to see some of the YouTube hits go down, and that's just it. So even when you are censoring, because the algorithm is not that smart, right? Like YouTube wants to have less conspiracy stuff, wants to, you know, get away from conspiracy stuff. Here I have this programming that is, you know, exactly what YouTube wants, but the algorithm's not smart enough to see that. So bam, the hits go down. So outside of censorship, and outside of the profit motives of these companies, the fact that algorithms, so-called artificial intelligence, as anybody who's using LLM knows, is not very smart. So we have to encounter that as we try to enter the media landscape for Gnosticism.
I think there's just a couple of quick things on that too. There's something I think interesting about the fact that we do release it as a YouTube show and a podcast, and that we don't make it as a YouTube show specifically. Like we're not doing things that YouTube shows do specifically, like reaction videos and
where's the special effects? There's no special effects.
Exactly. And we're not doing video essays, which are also pretty popular. It's still a talk show, which is, I think, lends itself to podcasts. But the other thing too is that podcasts in general are a more distributed medium. Like it's less algorithm heavy. Discovering it can be often a thing from the algorithm, but once people have found it, then they're subscribers. They're just getting it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting, and probably, like as John said, in terms of cannibalization, like yes, maybe some people moved from YouTube to our podcast specifically so they made sure they could hear it. You know, so I think that's something that's nice too, is that I think we've never catered to YouTube exclusively because we know that our audience isn't only wanting us there, only engaging with us there. But there is, I mean, honestly too, like part of the reason I've been focusing on mapping Gnosticism, the reason we've done episodes of Pop Gnosis, like Nick, you and I talked about Morrowind a while ago, which was super fun, is also because, to be frank though too, is that I think for people to discover us, it occurred to me that they were probably, maybe if they found us because they were already interested in those subjects, those like pop culture subjects, or because they want more of an introduction episode, versus us interviewing an academic who's a really interesting person to talk to on a very niche point, is like, that's great for us because we already know all that stuff, but that we needed to quote unquote make content, you know what I mean, for people who are joining us now, you know. So it is a difficult thing. Like even we are doing that thing of like going back to the basics, hopefully with some extrapolation.
There's internet slang called Eternal September, and which was it had to do with the early days of the internet. I think AOL message boards. You know, in September, people would get their free AOL discs and get online for the first time, and they'd be coming into forums, and they would have to learn how to use the forums and learn the protocols, and also the topics on the forums had already been, you know, they'd come in on the Gnostic forum, right, and ask a really basic question, you know, why doesn't Sophia make the demiurge go away, right? And that question had been asked 1,000 times. So Eternal September. Now, there is an issue with Eternal September in general with Gnosticism, and people who do any kind of Gnostic things in the meat world encounter that as well. So when I do parish here, there is often we often have it's people's first times, or their only time, or they're checking it out, right? And okay, this is not the best known spiritual tradition, so there's always a bit of an introductory aspect to it, right? I've heard the same thing with Buddhism, you know, and with in-person Buddhist groups, right? So people hear a little bit about Buddhism, but they don't know the basics. Yeah, lots of looky-loos. It just is what it is. I think there are ways to overcome it in the media landscape. I think we do some of those ways. Maybe we need to get better at linking back to old episodes, right? So if you half know what we're talking about, look, you can check out this episode, more leads to podcasts and blogs and online text or whatever, right? To help contextualize. We also have, as you said, Jason, a lot of introductory stuff and a lot of like stuff for the real heads. It is sort of randomly distributed. And in the past, it's been whatever I'm interested in that week, right? So sometimes it can be more of an introductory thing, and sometimes it's something where I don't even know what's going on. And I spend an hour going, yeah, oh, totally. Oh, never even thought of it like that before. I know exactly what you're talking about. Jason, I want to. So I gave one peek behind the curtain talking about the algorithm stuff, but I want to lift up the curtain even higher and talk about the very origins of this show. Now, I didn't start the show. I wasn't even a host until 6 years into it running or something like that. And the original founder of the show, and this was 2010, 2011, which is a long time ago now. Even then, they saw that the media landscape for Gnosticism didn't seem to be particularly healthy or helpful. Those are the words I'm trying to use instead of saying good, better, right? I think talk Gnosis is healthy and helpful, right? I'm not making a claim to superiority or spiritual enlightenment. I hope it is those two things. So I've put that onto the founder. So they wanted to get an alternative going.
Yeah.
And all these years later, we have many, I call them peers, but they're much more successful than us. We do have many peers who are also healthy and helpful, and I highly recommend checking out their shows. But that said, the media landscape, I don't know if you agree with me, there's maybe even more bad stuff out there on these many different platforms. What do you think about that, Jason?
I think you're right. And I think, well, it again goes back to, we've been talking about this algorithm issue, is that like a lot of the stuff that gets promoted by the algorithm is contentious stuff, is stuff that is dramatic or exciting, or like it's bold claims, like 12 ways to escape the demiurge or whatever, or like the secret the church doesn't want you to know, that kind of thing. Like, and because that's like, it's this thing where like, if rather than seeing that post of like 12 things the demiurge doesn't want you to know, or like, like 5 secrets that the church has kept under wraps or whatever, is that like the moment you see that, as like your brain might go, oh, I want to know those 5 secrets, I want to know those 12 things. But like, to know that the medium is the message kind of thing, like the reason that you are seeing it articulated that way isn't because that's the best way to say it, but because that is the way to get the algorithm to make sure it shows it to you. And once, especially if it's your occupation. So like we accept Patreon here. We accept PayPal, patreon.com/Gnostic, paypal.me/Gnostic. Like we're not above accepting, financial recompense for what we're doing here, but none of us here are doing it as our primary occupation. And so we're not driven to make sure that you find us that way. And we're not driven to doing something that only the algorithm will promote. But in terms of, I think what, John, I think what you're kind of getting at there too, is that when your discourse becomes entirely about creating something that caters to contentious, controversial statements or claims of that I'm going to give you the 12 secrets that'll solve everything, that it or like that, like here's how UFOs and libraries are connected. I literally just tried to take two UFOs are often in Gnostic circles, quote unquote. UFOs are in around there, but like what's some other weird random thing? Library.
I'm gonna call the show that when I post it.
Oh,
well, birds not existing. Did you see that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like you're right, John, there is a sense like partially like part of the reason I still like to do this show is because I feel like I want to make sure there are other voices to be found, that someone can go like, I'm tired of 12 reasons I'm being trapped by the archons, and I want to have like a healthy conversation about these topics. I want to find multiple perspectives. And so I think that's kind of what we are trying to do here. But there is also like, I want to, because the thing is like this stuff exists because it does work. Like it does grab people's attention. And what I want to do, this is like, I don't know, maybe it's me as a Libra here, but like I want to acknowledge the validity of the instinct that has people follow that lead. That like, the feeling that that there's a system that needs to be rebelled from is, I think, a healthy feeling. It's the beginning of that what can open a door towards being critical generally. The trick is not to flip from one conclusion to another conclusion automatically. Like, I used to believe X, now I believe Y, and I believe Y as devoutly as I believed X. I think that, to me, it's far more interesting to go like, okay, I'm now critical of X, and I am interested in Y. I am also critical of Y, if that makes sense. That, like, I think, like, to be a Gnostic, and this might get into because we're also going to work on a show here called What Isn't Gnosticism. I think to be a Gnostic is to be critical even of Gnosticism.
Yes. Yeah, I've often said that it's a religion that is critical of religion, and that it involves itself, its own denomination, its own thought. I think there's always a call to criticality there. Jason, something else that I think is tying into what you're talking about. You can correct me if it doesn't. But I've often talking about the media landscape and how there's often this connection between conspiracy culture, conspiracy theories, and Gnosticism in a lot of this media and in a lot of people's minds. Now, that connection, of course, the Gnostic mythology does say that this reality is a conspiracy theory, right? That's why it works so well. But I don't think that is at the root of quote unquote true, helpful, happy, life-giving religion. Okay. But that said, so conspiracies get at something real. Like, conspiracy theorists are getting at something real, but they've mythologized it, right? Like, the world is in a pretty rough spot right now. So they look at all the many bad things that are going on as we speak, and their answer to these actual bad things is a kind of mythology that does point to something that is real. And that said, some really crazy out there aspects of conspiracy theories, maybe just one aspect, can be true, right? I mean, look, I made fun of QAnon of everybody else. Looks like I got egg in my face because a elite cadre of pedophiles actually does run the world. So whoops, sorry. So you can have one part in a conspiracy theory that is true, but a lot of times it is creating a mythology around real issues. So I thought that kind of ties into some of what you're saying.
Yeah, I would say another thing related to that, and it gets to be a little bit on the media aspect of, like, these are 12 ways to free yourself or whatever, is that the other aspect of that is what is the goal of the media? Because the goal of Gnosticism or the goal of a religious or spiritual tradition, and even the stated goal of that video, might not be the actual goal, because, like we're saying about monetization and other things, that's, I mean, so something, and I'm trying to relate how this would be like the conspiracy theory thing. I think the attempt is to understand the world and to kind of diagnose the problems, like we're saying. So there's aspects of conspiracy theories that make sense, like people's skepticism and, the criticism they have of, like, people in power. That all makes sense. But then the actual goal of something like QAnon isn't necessarily to, like, fight the pedophile ring like they thought. It's actually, probably something else, whether that's like a, propaganda for some political cause or, whatever. So it's all, so I guess what I'm thinking about, because the media, is it possible at all to ever have the goal of a spirituality align with your content creation, really, if your content creation has some sort of monetized purpose or some sort of institutionalized purpose? That's that.
Yeah, there is something here too about the recursive relationship between audience and creator or writer or what have you, and that when as a content creator you are creating almost like at the behest of your audience, because, like, what they want, or what you think they want, or what succeeds, like what. And that, I mean, this isn't to say that you shouldn't give the audience what they want, if that makes, like, it's not an elitism that we know better than the audience, but that sometimes part of the reason, like, what we're doing as content creators is we're thinking deeply about a subject. We are, then synopsizing that or connecting all of those things out loud for the audience, because we've done that extra work and we're showing that work. If you're only doing the work in response, if that makes sense. So, like, I know that I shouldn't say I know. I don't specifically know this, but I would not be in any way surprised if there were folks in the Gnostic media landscape who jumped on the QAnon train when it was popular and pretty much ignored it when it disappeared because they were following wherever their audience seemed to want to go.
Yeah.
But when like one of the things I would say here is like, so because we're not focused on just being a rebellious quote unquote Gnostic podcast, it means as well that if we say something that we let them learn is wrong, our audience can know that we will address that.
Yeah.
If it turned out that like the Nag Hammadi was a hoax, like let's just say I don't think it is, but like let's say that we learned that all of those texts were literally made up, and we had to reevaluate a lot of what we thought about Gnosticism because of that. I would say we're comfortable with that. We're comfortable with being able to do that because we're not relying on just the vibe, if that makes sense, just the response that the audience seems to want. We are interested in the subject. And if the subject changes, we are interested in that change. If that makes sense as a difference.
No, I think it's even true with spiritual. I was gonna say at one point that like, a spiritual teacher isn't just supposed to say the things that their audience wants, but obviously in history that often they have, because that's how you have followers and people showing up and money and alms, and they'll buy you lunch and whatever. So so it isn't. I guess it wouldn't be fair to say it's entirely like a problem with things like YouTube and podcast. Like this is always a perennial problem if you money to eat and
would it be fair to say that like a real Gnostic experience would be something that doesn't immediately like become something that you agree with, like that's something that is already approves everything that you're thinking?
Yeah, it really should be the opposite.
Well, I mean, or if not even the opposite, like I think it's not just opposite, it's other, if that makes sense. Like it's a breakthrough of an other kind of experience that doesn't address, it doesn't reframe everything perfectly. Oh, now this is what's good and this is what's bad.
I agree, and I think that's an amazing insight, Jason, because that is a specifically Gnostic experience as opposed to a mystical experience or a eureka moment or an insight. That kind of reorientation, what you're saying, is not okay. I've seen the face of God, and now I know what is right and wrong, what is black and white, and I have a new direction in my life. It's I have seen the face of God, and I don't know anything anymore. I wanted to talk a little bit, Jason, just coming back to your you and Nick's points about audience, right? So there is a concept, and you were basically touching on this, called audience capture. So I'll give you a completely hypothetical situation. So say you have a Gnostic podcast, right? Maybe in the early days of podcasting, and it's going fairly well, and you're interviewing some really great scholars. You have a great reputation, but maybe you as the host, you come from a previous generation where conspiracy theories were dangerous like they are now. It's kind of fun, right? In the 90s, early 2000s, basically pre 9/11. Conspiracy theories was kind of associated with quirky, left-leaning people, right? And a lot of people didn't take them that seriously, but they were fun to read with and talk about. So you have that in your background, and maybe you do a couple episodes that are leaning a little bit more conspiracy, or you have a guest that takes you by surprise and connects Gnosticism by conspiracy, and you notice that this content is doing a lot better. That the people who really liked this piece of content are sharing it, they're commenting, they're subscribing. So logically, you're looking at the numbers and you're going to be like, well, I'm going to do another show like that. That one does even better. Well, you need to pay some bills. So what are you going to do next time? Another show like that. And so suddenly you're saying that according to Gnosticism, the moon isn't real. You can really go down a deep rabbit hole there with the audience capture. In many ways, it is understandable, especially if you are doing this to each. Right. Well, and there's lots of things you can tell yourself too, right? Because I was less of a conspiracy theorist, but now I've seen the light, and look how popular it is. This must really be helping people. Just look at the numbers compared to where they were before when I was doing like this hardcore academia stuff, right? Well, the numbers don't lie. The truth is getting out there. More people are finding out about Gnosticism. I'm a good guy and doing good things. So audience capture is something that is very real. Right. And I think it's something that it has always been there, always been present in any kind of art or media. But due to the immediate feedback of digital media, And the way that you can tweak things due to those stats and those KPIs, I think it is definitely much more powerful, much more insidious now. So it's not just the algorithm, right? We have, as you folks were also talking about, we have this audience, this two-way audience capture trap as well.
And like this is what I was saying there too when I was discussing that recursion, like that the author and the writer, or the author and the reader, are sort of in this back and forth, is that you're right. Like I think like you do something that then finds an audience, or that the audience engages in, again, the social media language, engages with more, and you run in that direction. And that, like, maybe like, as you were saying, like early days of podcasting, at the time it was a lark, it was fun, like it's part of the fun of playing with conspiracy theories. But then, you find that you've been doing now conspiracy work for decades, and maybe you at somewhere along the way, not a discrete point, but in spectrum, or like over time, you've now maybe, like, at the very least, you're no longer holding those conspiracies at the same distance, perhaps, that you used to. And, or at the very least, as you engage with your audience, it's no longer like, isn't this interesting? And it's a bit more like, this is real, this is happening. That like the audience capture works both ways. Like you might have captured more audience, but more audience and the needs of that audience have captured you.
Yeah. I wonder if, I was thinking about this as you're saying that, and I think that's a really good way of putting it, because is there something on Gnosticism explicitly, or especially to Gnosticism, that would, I think yes, basically that's what I'm saying, is that would critique that? Because I know that we've been thinking a little about like fandoms and stuff. That's a whole, it's like the creation of a world, like the relationship between the content creator and the audience, and that creates, I mean, there's something demiurgical about that, right? That you've created an entire kind of world system that people become in. It has its own norms and rules and laws. And as like you're saying, this this fictional conspiracy podcaster, eventually like the fans will have certain ways of thinking that it's approved and not. And that I think there's something in Gnosticism that's explicitly going to be like, that seems problematic, right? To create like an entire kind of world that has these laws that you're stuck in at this point.
This is exactly it. That. Well, and I know I've said this many times, but like Gnosticism, as I understand it, isn't like a new religion or a different religion with the same framework as the old religion, which is to say, you used to have 10 commandments. Now you've got like 4, passwords for the archons or whatever. Like it's not a 1-to-1. And I think like even too, like, so John at one point said that like, oh yeah, there are Gnostic texts that say that the world is the world is bad and conspiracies are real. And I would even say like some Gnostic texts, but not all Gnostic texts. And when we talk about being Gnostic or being agnostic or even the Gnostics, and we've talked about this before, but like every time we use that term, like in my mind, we have to basically acknowledge that we're using it as an umbrella, like that there are, I would say, Gnostic texts that, if not oppose the world prison theory, at the very least do not validate it. Like, and the Gnostic texts we have. So there are folks who've decided, or like they come from the perspective that, and you guys would know the term for this better than me, but like that everything in the Bible from beginning to end is all part of one specific story, and that you're supposed to read it as one text, even though it was composed over many, many, many years, many, many years. And so just taking that concept on its own, like the reason you can't apply that to the Gnostic texts is because those were, for one thing, books that were kicked out of the Bible or definitely removed, but also we're often being written in response to the text that we are talking about in the Bible. And so as soon as you know that you're now in a like literary recursive, like in a reader response theory, in a way, that capacity to try to read all of the Gnostic texts together as though they are saying one thing, like the Gnostics who wrote it, we know weren't trying to do that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, so it's on its face. We can't say that like the Sethian text is as true as the Valentinian text.
Yeah. And Jason, just to be pedantic, it's not that they were kicked out of the Bible or removed from the Bible, but the Gnostic texts were just never included in the Bible. So a small little twist there. The Gnostic texts for the most part, weren't supposed to replace the books that are in the Bible. They're not supposed to be completely alter a complete counter Christianity. You're supposed to read them hand in hand, because the Gnostic texts don't make much sense without reading the biblical text first, right? Now, they are sometimes complete inversions, or this is the true story, or this is what happened before Genesis happened. This is the true story about Genesis. But like, you don't have any context. You like, the secret book of John just doesn't read very well if you haven't read Genesis and if you haven't read the Gospel of John. So again, being a bit pedantic, but I think that this is an important point for what we're talking about when it comes to Gnostic media. That there's just so much. There's just so much to tackle with. I think there are some basic ideas where you don't need a PhD and have to read all of these texts. I think that there are ideas that are intuitive. I think there's ideas that people get in their own lives and their dreams. I think of all these texts and scholarship disappeared, Gnosticism will come back because it's wired into us. But all that said, we're coming into that eternal September problem forever, right? And in some ways, it's good, because all the time I kind of have to start over in my spiritual life, right? I need new introductions to this stuff. I need to start over. I need to go from square one, because, okay, I just noticed something new, or I forgot about that, or I never thought of it this way, or I really need to refresh myself, or I really need somebody else to tell me the basics, what they see as the basics. Talking about Gnostic media, there is some advantages, and going back to I've completely got us off our present points, but coming back to the beginning, where there are some advantages to the eternal September that these platforms force us to do, right? That are good for both us and for the people listening.
There is that sense of like approaching a newbie question honestly does always kind of make sure you're still believing your own answer to that question, to that, to re-encounter that question. And that's, again, sort of a silver lining opportunity here. There is something else here, though, too. Like, John, you mentioned the PhD, which I think is interesting. But like, some ideas you don't need a PhD to understand, or you don't need to have read a bunch of text to understand. This was something else that I thought was interesting, and this might be an interesting subject to discuss on its own show. Every time we do one of these shows, we come up with like 5 more ideas for more shows, but this was this was ironically a YouTube video. I haven't finished it yet, so I will decide if it's worth providing a link to once I've finished it, which is me performing a certain amount of curation here. But what I think it made an interesting point about was that especially with like the advent of certain kinds of approaches to esoterica in the like late 1800s, early 1900s, of like this idea of like publishing as much as you can, providing as much information as possible, is that people are encountering ideas that prior to that sort of explosion of information, by the time you encountered that idea, you would have done a certain amount of other either spiritual work or academic work to get to that idea. And that without that preparation, it can then mean that you've jumped to the least healthy understanding of the detail. And so like some of this, like the idea that the world is a prison, like a literal physical prison that you are magically literally escaping from if you say the right passwords, is that like the reason that's not healthy is because the people who were writing that weren't writing it as a like I can give this to you now, you can read the following text and poof, you're gone. Like it was never meant as a process. By the time you learned that idea, you'd already been through a long mystical education, if that makes sense, like, or an initiation, or you'd been through a lot of schooling. And so you're understanding that some of these terms that they're using are political for the time. Some of them are like responding to biblical texts at the time that were contentious in their own ways. And then you can frame what you're learning in a way that can allow you to bridge it to today. But without that, you are like, it's like you're, you haven't built up the both the knowledge and the psychological self-reliance to be able to hold the difficult concept of a world that might not like you without taking it entirely seriously.
I think, that's become a debate even in mainstream churches. I think this idea, there used to be like an initiation sequence. I think occultists are familiar, esotericists are familiar with that idea, like degrees, things like that. But even this idea of like baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, I mean, now there's debates about having open Eucharist where you don't need to be baptized, either for a theological reason or it's just, I think there's both a theological and kind of in the modern era, it's hard to say, well, you're not at this point yet. It's like hard to do that. You want to be welcoming into everybody. I don't know if that responds really to the point, but it's what it sounds like is that books in the late 19th century were supplementing, some experience that was also going on or some kind of practice that was going on. It wasn't going to tell you everything. Like you had to have some sort of initiation get the context to be able to grasp the things you're reading. So,
yeah. Well, and I think specifically too, I think yes to that, especially, and that it's like, I struggle with this idea because I believe generally that like a spread of information is good. Like more information is generally better. But when I encountered this idea, I thought it was really interesting that like, particularly like ontologically upsetting information, like, or ideas are not necessarily, like that it's reasonable to suggest that complicated ideas require, more context, more information, whether or not that context comes from initiation or from study or from mentorship and community. The idea that you should encounter a classic Gnostic text and expect that you will understand it immediately in all of its spiritual significance, I think is something that like that's not a reasonable thing we should expect of anybody, and that a person shouldn't expect on their own. Especially because Gnosticism to me is never like the whole point is that you don't learn it, you experience it. It's not Gnosis of book learning, like that you pass the test. It's this is all just scaffolding to like help you launch into something that you can't learn any other way.
I've been to physical therapy before for like some back stuff, and it's like they teach you exercises or, you do a gym class or whatever, or yoga. You're taught, you could read about the exercise and even do it once or twice, but then you're not like, okay, I did it, I'm now done. Like your body has to be trained in a certain way through repetition and through the actual experience, or else it doesn't matter. Like it's not, it's something that has to be internalized over time, I think. And so spirituality has to do that too.
It's a process. Like it's seeing it as a process, not a conclusion that you reach, like the way you do a math problem.
Right.
And I don't want to suggest either too here. Like, I mean, there's often the joke idea of to me, it's a joke. The idea that the Gnostics are the elite. We even I think our Facebook group is called the Gnostic Elite, which was always meant as a wink into that idea. But it's also the elite to which anyone can be a member, because it's not about you're special because you figured it out or you discovered it. Because you took the time to engage with it is what allows you to access this. But it's all about like, it's not like some people are more special than others.
Yeah.
It's just more like the Gnostic path was the path that seemed best to you, you being the like archetypal listener that might be listening to us here. And that the initiation element idea, or the idea of like learning something that you have to practice before you can do the next thing, isn't about that you need to be a certain level of special to get the real wisdom. That's like the opposite of what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah.
But more that it's healthy to expect that that there's work involved. One of the things so I'm very fascinated by classical Stoicism. We had Donald Robertson, a Stoic philosopher and academic, on the show. And like Stoicism, a lot of the main points of Stoicism are relatively simple to describe. That like you should consider that like if things are outside of your control, you shouldn't put a lot of emotional weight on them. You should consider like there's certain like virtues that are, again, like fairly common sense. They don't rely on a lot of spiritual background. They're more like community focused. Although I know that there's a Stoicism cosmology and things, but the reason I bring it up is that, again, online, a lot of the discourse around Stoicism will have somebody say like, X has happened to me. What do the Stoics say I should do about it? And this response is always pretty much the same. Like, what emotions are you attaching to this thing that has happened to you? Can you control it? If not, you should try to put less emotional attachment on it, And one of the things I've started to say in those spaces is that I try to remind people that Stoic process is not an algorithm, a math problem, like a process that you follow and then you're done. You're now a Stoic and nothing bothers you. It is a muscle process. It's a thing you exercise to get better and better at, so that you are more and more resilient. And like, I feel like I've learned a lot from that. It has helped me in a lot of ways. I also had a really bad weekend last weekend, and my emotional resilience wasn't really there. I tried to apply Stoicism to it, and I did it to some success, but it didn't turn it off. You know what I mean? And that, to the same point, like to your point there, Nick, about getting into spiritual tradition and practice, these are things that are not because doing them equals salvation. It's that doing them is doing the push-ups of your physical therapy,
Yeah.
to be able to do a heavier lift later.
Yeah, I wonder if also based on this conversation, if the types of media that are now popular don't lend themselves. I mean, they don't lend themselves well to that sort of point. They're more like, I'm going to give you this one thing, and then, yeah, like we're saying, that will solve everything instantly. Which is, it's like the yoga pose thing or something. Like, so it's not gatekeeping if you're like, you can't do this advanced yoga pose without all this preparation. It's just that you might like break your neck or something. Like, it's just how it works in reality. So, it's not, but I think that the way we have this culture now, it feels very gatekeeped to be told you can't do certain things, or we're used to money being the way to get into a thing, really.
Well, yeah. Also, join my premium member feed, or my Patreon only chat room, to get the real secrets kind of thing. We'll give you half the episode and then you have to pay. We kind of to that point, so I'm going to kind of move us towards an ending here, but so I found a post online about different styles of playing Dungeons and Dragons that to me seemed pretty connected to what it is to see it for online Gnostic discourse. And I think there is probably a not insignificant amount of overlap between people who play D&D and people who are interested in Gnosticism. But so this person, I'll try to quote most of this here. And so he's talking about, or they, I don't know their gender, but the person is talking about an online culture of playing Dungeons and Dragons in an old school way. So as close to the old rules when they first came out as possible. And so here's what they say. There are problems in the online culture of OSR play because it includes the kind of people who use X and Blue Sky and love to tweet takes. So much of the conversations are basically performative. Many participants, even major ones, do not really play the game, or in our case, maybe are Gnostics. Others selling products have a vested interest in promoting their school of design, which is inevitably a bunch of horse poop. Amid the circling tweets are people who really want to play are misled. They think in circles about how to start an RPG campaign or how to participate in Gnosticism, even though it is really a very simple thing that children constantly do better than adults. Or like children constantly do to better success than adults. I found that like weirdly perfectly encapsulating the online discourse I find in Gnosticism, because this notion of performative posting that is not about responding back and forth. I have a question, you have an answer, that's interesting, let me reply to your answer, let's go back and forth. It is, I am asserting a position, a point of view, and all I am doing is continually asserting that. Whatever it is we're saying back and forth, I'm just continually asserting this thing. And maybe because I have a Substack, I have a YouTube, I have a whatever, and that people who find themselves engaged by Gnosticism find this content. And as I was saying at the beginning, how we talk about a thing helps map the landscape of that thing. They then feel that to be a Gnostic is to have to participate in the ways they are seeing it presented, which is, again, another reason why I think Talk Gnosis is so important, because we're trying to show that you can be a Gnostic without subscribing to all the takes. But then the other thing is that, and I think there's also something here too, maybe the difference between Gnosticism and Dungeons and Dragons, but only slightly, is that because Gnosticism has religious connotations, people also will post not just in a discourse, but in a sense of, you used this phrase earlier, John, spreading the word. They now feel that they feel excited about what they've discovered in Gnosticism, and it's no longer just discussing it, but convincing, evangelizing in many ways. But the other thing about this too is that the term Gnostic is itself fuzzy, not just for the reason it's an umbrella, but because other people use it. Like Aleister Crowley uses it. I don't exactly know how to pronounce his name, but Samuel Onwear, that like I think he's used the term Gnostic in a lot of his material so that it's something people find when they start to Google it. But you don't know how they're using it until you work with the material, at which point maybe you're fairly deep into it. Um, and then maybe there's a sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've read this much, I might as well keep going. And what this makes me think of is that like, so if you start to think of yourself as a Gnostic, for whatever reason, because of whatever material you've consumed or show you've followed or whatever, you might start to think that anything that has Gnostic in it as a term is a thing you either need to be a fan of or opposed to. The same way that a Star Wars fan will has to consume all Star Wars related material, but then you've wasted hours watching Ewoks: The Battle for Endor or the Star Wars Holiday Special. Although we should perhaps do an esoteric decoding of the Star Wars Holiday Special next Christmas. But yeah, like I think there's something interesting there about the notion of the loyalty to the term when the term itself is fuzzy and a lot of people use it. Nick, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that this is something that you were saying, or writing kind of in the notes for this, but yeah, it just made me think of this comment of how in every conversation there's, am I answering the question about what I think so that we're going back and forth, or am I answering what ancient Gnostics thought or whatever this theological perspective was or whatever? I feel like I have that in just to myself, like I have conversation about this stuff and I have to try to remember, like, am I trying to answer this for myself? Which is useful because I'm trying to sort out what I think and have like a real intimate conversation with someone about this, or am I only answering from the brand that I studied, so I represent that brand to some extent. I mean, brand rather than, I guess school of thought would be better, but this happens a lot with religion for me. Like I'll be like, out like at a bar or something, and somebody, if they find out you study this stuff, people have a lot of opinions, and I feel like I frequently end up back in and I do think this still relates to this kind of like canon and sunk cost fallacy kind of thing. Like I start to answer from the perspective of mainstream theology or whatever says this, because and maybe that's a little bit of it because a lot of people involved in this stuff want to be are educators in some sense, or slightly academic in some sense, or really academic, but it becomes less about like what's the actual real human back and forth that might get to the heart of it, and more like first there's this layer of kind of answering from the canon, and to some extent, like and that I'm not sure. Okay, we went from the Ewoks thing to that, but I do think that, because I do think in arguments about fandoms like that, there's always an argument about the canon of whatever, like Marvel or something.
Yeah,
it's the same kind of debate about like what's the answer through canon or something. Like it's not, and completely nerds tend to be into that. You start to forget about why you like the thing or why it's meaningful in your life, and then it's now the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I've mentioned this on the show before, but who knows? This might be someone's first show with us. So, but I know this is a fascinating point to me, because I know somebody who was a hardcore, as I say, an evangelical atheist. So they were so into atheism they needed to convince everybody else too, and which I think there's an irony there. But anyway, so we posted a blog post saying, here's some archaeological evidence that proves that Noah's flood never happened. The world was never covered in water. So like, take that, religious people. And then his very next post was being upset that that Disney had rendered the expanded universe of Star Wars, the expanded universe of Star Wars, legendary. So first he's proudly telling a bunch of people that their faith is fictional. Yeah. And then he is now upset that books that still exist and are still for sale are slightly more fictional.
They're not the official real Star Wars fiction.
Yeah, which never happened anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, like Luke Skywalker does not exist. There is no Jabba the Hutt. None of these things actually exist, and yet he was really upset about it.
And it be useful for him to explain, why do those books matter to you? Like, what did it do reading that? Like, maybe. I mean, as far as I read them in like 5th grade, so I don't actually think they're that great. But it's like, why was it so meaningful to you that you care about this so much? That could be an important question, but not. I think that's over whether it's canon. But
yeah, and I think it's a great question. I mean, there's also, I think, a thing here too to say that as the Disney Star Wars has continued, they have continued to borrow from that expanded universe too. Like, it's not like they rendered it gone. It's not like they said it was legendary and you will never see any of this content ever again. You know what I mean? They
Look,
didn't
people,
throw the book.
General Zod is he's right there in cartoons and live action now. So
Yeah, exactly. And now the debate is whether or not it's like expanded universe Thrawn or Disney Thrawn, because Disney Thrawn isn't as good as it, you know. But like, again, this person doesn't actually exist. There's no historicity here. Like, and
Most
and that's
controversial thing that's been said.
show you.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, heck, if we want to engage the algorithm, we'd need to just do a Star Wars Gnosticism show. And so, I don't know, if you like that idea, please say so in the comments. Tell us your ideas about Star Wars and Gnosticism. But yeah, so yeah, and because I think the other thing too is like, when we, again, like, the reason I think that Star Wars idea, like, if I like Star Wars, I have to read everything, I have to consume everything, is something I also think is important about, and this is maybe me moving into our ending here, is like that to me, the Gnostic move, I've said this so many times, is about being critical, which includes Gnosticism. You should be critical of things that are said to be Gnostic, which to me is about how, like, you're not being anti-Gnostic to not want to engage with, say, the Sethian texts. You're not being anti-Gnostic to not engage with the Valentinian texts, you know, or when I say not engage with, like, to not accept them the same way someone might previously have accepted the Old Testament or something. It is Gnostic to question them. It is Gnostic to question Gnosticism. But I think the other thing too, as we were talking about all this media landscape and the notion of the algorithm, like, I think it's also worth saying that, like, the world in 2026 is pretty rough right now, particularly in the States and in like all over the world. There's all kinds of terrible things that are going on, and shadowy forces that are, you know, like that is a reflection of what QAnon pretended to talk about. And it makes sense that people would come to Gnosticism as a frame to hold some of that in. And I think the trick is that when they're only using it as a frame of the negativity side, like this is that the world is a prison. It's like, to me, that's only ever halfway Gnosticism, because you're never talking about Gnosis. You're just talking about a frame that lets you feel better about how everything else is going on. We've talked about conspiracies a couple of times here, and I think this is something that is connected as well to what I'm trying to express about, I think, the value of what we do on the show and what Gnosticism can actually offer is there's a quote by Alan Moore about conspiracy theories. He worked on a comic called Brought to Light, which is, I think, really hard to find now, but it was a history of the CIA. So he did a lot of research into this. So, like, pretty much everything in there is pretty well sourced. And what he said was, the main thing that I've learned about conspiracy theory is that conspiracy theorists actually believe in a conspiracy because that is more comforting. The truth of the world is that it is chaotic. The truth is that it is not the Jewish banking conspiracy or the gray aliens or the 12-foot reptilioids from another dimension that are in control. The truth is more frightening. Nobody is in control. The world is rudderless. And yes, there is a conspiracy. In fact, there are a great number of conspiracies that are all tripping each other up. And all of those conspiracies are run by paranoid fantasists and ham-fisted clowns. If you are on a list targeted by the CIA, you really have nothing to worry about. If, however, you have a name similar to somebody on a list targeted by the CIA, then you are probably dead. That's his take on Gnosticism, or no, sorry, not on Gnosticism, on conspiracies. But what I find Gnostic about this is not the affirmation that there are conspiracies, but the call to step beyond the comforting frame.
Yeah.
And I think true Gnosticism, true bravery, is to step beyond the comforting frame and into an unknowing that is, like, when I was saying earlier, like, the idea for me of Gnosis is not something that is the opposite of whatever you were thinking of before, but is completely other. It stands apart. Its frame of reference changes everything completely. So it's not that good becomes bad and bad becomes good, but how you are defining good and bad are completely reevaluated. And that anyone who tells you this is now good and this is now bad because I've had Gnosis, I'm sorry, you haven't reevaluated enough.
Well, I think that's a powerful place to start to say goodbye. As we've mentioned before, you can give us money. We'd like helps us keep the show going. Our software is actually surprisingly expensive just to do a simple show like this. But you can do patreon.com/Gnostic for recurring monthly payments. And you can do one-time payments over at paypal.me/Gnostic.
We would definitely appreciate that. And we're always trying to think of like what we could possibly offer that would be in some way exclusive, but also not keep any information behind. I wonder if there's almost like, from what we've talked about here today, I wonder if there's almost like we could accept from our Patreon patrons, what's an idea you want us to challenge and critique, not affirm. Do you know what I mean? Please tell me that the following gospel is correct, but more like, what's something that you believe strongly you want us to critique, that you want us to be Gnostic about, you know?
Yeah, that would be amazing. And on our last show, more people did join in the comments, and we are doing this again because we want you to give us money, but we're not making any money off of this. We're not going to do it just for engagement. We're not doing it for the algorithm. We, just like Jason was saying, we want to hear from you. We want you to join the conversation. We want your Gnosis, right? I personally want to kind of selfishly, not to have the show do better and the YouTube algorithm, but because I'm someone who is hungry for knowledge at all times, right? So please join in the conversation below on whatever platform you're listening or watching this on, or on the social media that you found us, wherever. Join on in. We will find you. We will discourse. We can't wait to hear from you.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right.